Hi, I'm Sarah. On what should have been the happiest day of my life, my own mother stood up during my wedding reception and announced to 200 guests that I'd stolen valor, that my Purple Heart was fake, and that I'd never even deployed. The room went silent except for my hidden microphone, recording every lie they thought would destroy me forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning started like every bride dreams it would. Sunlight streamed through the hotel suite windows, casting golden rays across my wedding dress, hanging pristine and ivory against the closet door. My bridesmaids bustled around me, applying final touches of makeup while champagne bubbled in flutes nobody had time to drink. Outside, Lake Tahoe stretched endlessly blue beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains, the same mountains I'd dreamed about during those long nights in Afghanistan when I wondered if I'd ever make it home to see them again. My maid of honor, Jessica, held up the pearl earrings my grandmother had worn at her own wedding in 1952. "Something old," she whispered, fastening them carefully behind my ears. The weight felt significant, like carrying forward a legacy of strong women who'd weathered their own storms. Jessica had been my roommate at Fort Carson before my deployment, the one person who knew exactly what those 18 months overseas had cost me, physically and emotionally. She understood why my hands sometimes trembled during loud noises, why I startled at unexpected sounds, why crowds made me scan for exits before I could relax. "You look absolutely radiant," said my cousin, Maya, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of my dress. Maya had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over tensions at holiday gatherings when my mother would make her pointed comments about my military service. She'd grown up idolizing me, following me around family reunions, asking endless questions about basic training and deployment stories. Now she worked as a teacher in Sacramento, and her presence today felt like having at least one family member firmly in my corner. The suite filled with the familiar chaos of wedding preparation. Hairstylists worked their magic while the photographer captured candid moments of laughter and anticipation. My something blue was a small ribbon sewn inside my dress, the same shade as my dress blues uniform hanging in my closet back home. Something borrowed was my sister-in-law's vintage clutch, delicate beadwork that caught the light when I moved. Everything felt perfect, ceremonial, like the universe was finally aligning after years of struggle and healing. But even in these precious moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked beneath the surface. My mother, Patricia, had been unusually quiet during the entire wedding planning process. No opinions about flowers, no insistence on specific traditions, no emotional moments over dress shopping, just a cold politeness that felt more unsettling than outright conflict. When I'd asked her about it, she'd simply said she wanted this day to be exactly what I wanted, which should have been comforting, but somehow felt ominous instead. My father, Colonel James Mitchell, retired Army after 32 years of service, had been equally distant. The man who'd taught me to shoot, who'd encouraged my enlistment, who'd pinned my sergeant stripes on my uniform with tears in his eyes, now seemed to look through me rather than at me. During our father-daughter dance rehearsal, he'd gone through the motions mechanically, like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating his daughter's happiness. The tension had been building for months, ever since I'd gotten engaged to David. David Chen, a pediatric surgeon I'd met during my recovery at Walter Reed Medical Center. He'd been doing his residency rotation through the trauma ward, and we'd connected over late-night conversations about healing, purpose, and building something meaningful from broken pieces. David understood my nightmares without judgment, celebrated my victories without condescension, and loved every scarred and healing part of me without reservation. But my family had never warmed to him, not because of his ethnicity, they insisted, but because they claimed he was taking advantage of my vulnerability. They'd made subtle comments about him being an opportunist, someone who sought out damaged veterans for easy relationships. The accusations stung because they revealed how my own family saw me, not as a decorated soldier who'd served her country with honor, but as damaged goods, vulnerable and easily manipulated. 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd overheard a phone conversation between my mother and my Aunt Helen. They'd been speaking in hushed tones in the kitchen while I was supposedly napping upstairs, recovering from a particularly difficult physical therapy session. Their words drifted up through the old house's thin floors like poison seeping through cracks. "She's not the same person who left for Afghanistan," my mother had said, her voice tight with something that sounded like disgust rather than concern. "This whole military persona, this wounded warrior act, it's getting out of hand. David doesn't know what he's getting into." "Maybe someone should tell him," Aunt Helen had replied, "before it's too late." "Maybe someone should tell everyone," my mother had whispered back. I'd lain in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd heard. My own mother discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, a deception to be exposed. The woman who'd raised me, who'd sent care packages during deployment, who'd cried when I was wounded by an IED blast outside Kandahar, now seemed to view my service as some kind of elaborate lie. That conversation had planted a seed of paranoia that grew stronger as the wedding approached. I'd started noticing things, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, meaningful glances exchanged between family members, my mother's phone calls that she'd suddenly end when I appeared. Something was being planned, and every instinct I'd developed as a soldier told me I was walking into an ambush, so I'd made a decision that felt both paranoid and prudent. I'd purchased a small digital recording device, the kind private investigators use, no bigger than a USB drive. 3 days before the wedding, I'd sewn it carefully into the inner seam of my wedding dress, positioned where it would capture conversations clearly while remaining completely hidden. The battery would last for hours, the memory could store an entire day's worth of audio, and the device was so small that not even my dress fittings had revealed its presence. Jessica thought I was being overly cautious when I'd confided in her. "Your family loves you," she'd insisted. "They're probably just processing their own emotions about the wedding. Parents get weird when their kids get married." But I'd learned to trust my instincts. In Afghanistan, that hypervigilance had kept me alive when our convoy hit that roadside bomb. The same sixth sense that told me to check the road ahead one more time, to question the placement of that seemingly innocent trash pile, was now screaming that danger approached in the form of family betrayal. Maya had noticed my tension during the rehearsal dinner the night before. "You seem on edge," she'd observed as we stood together on the restaurant's deck, watching the sunset over the lake. Pre-wedding jitters? I'd wanted to tell her everything, to voice my suspicions and fears. But Maya was still young, still believed in family loyalty and unconditional love. She hadn't learned yet that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of the deepest betrayals. Instead, I'd simply said I was nervous about the ceremony, about standing in front of so many people and making such public promises. Now, as I stood in the bridal suite surrounded by friends and the scent of jasmine and roses, I touched the hidden device through the layers of silk and lace. Whatever my family had planned, whatever ambush awaited me, I would be ready. The girl who'd survived an IED blast and 18 months of recovery wasn't going to be taken down by wedding day sabotage. The photographer called for final portraits before we headed to the ceremony. As I posed with my bouquet of white peonies and eucalyptus, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back appeared confident, radiant, ready to step into her new life with grace and joy. But behind her eyes lurked the alertness of a soldier who'd learned that attacks often come from the directions you least expect, wearing the faces you trust most. Before we dive deeper into what happened that day, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt like the people who should protect you the most were actually plotting against you? Maybe it was family members whispering behind closed doors, or friends who smiled to your face while spreading rumors behind your back. Drop a comment below And tell me where you're watching from, because what happened to me might feel painfully familiar. Sometimes the biggest battles we fight aren't on foreign soil, they're right at our own dinner tables. The limousine ride to the ceremony venue felt like traveling through a dream sequence. Lake Tahoe's crystalline waters reflected the afternoon sun in dancing diamonds, while pine trees stood sentinel along the winding mountain roads. My bridesmaids chattered excitedly about the upcoming reception, debating whether the band would play enough slow songs and wondering if David's college roommates would attempt their infamous karaoke routine they'd been threatening all weekend. Jessica sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand when she noticed my faraway stare. She knew me well enough to recognize when my mind was elsewhere, cycling through potential scenarios and escape routes. It was a habit I'd developed overseas, always having contingency plans, always being prepared for situations to deteriorate rapidly. Most people called it anxiety. I called it survival instinct. "Earth to Sarah," Maya laughed from across the limo, holding up her phone to show me pictures she'd taken during our getting ready session. "You're going to love these shots of you with Grandma's earrings. You look just like her in that old wedding." Photo from the hallway. The mention of my grandmother sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. Eleanor Mitchell had been the strongest woman I'd ever known, raising 4 children while my grandfather served multiple deployments during Vietnam. She'd understood military life in ways my mother never seemed to grasp, had been the one person who never questioned my decision to enlist or made me feel like my service was somehow inappropriate for a woman. Grandma Eleanor had passed away 2 years ago, just 6 months after I'd returned from Afghanistan. I'd been so deep in my own recovery process that I'd barely been present for her final weeks, something that still haunted me during quiet moments. She'd been the one who taught me that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up every single time. Her absence today felt particularly sharp, like losing the one family member who would have stood firmly in my corner regardless of whatever storm was brewing. "She would have loved David," I murmured, touching the pearl earring softly. She always said the right person would see past the scars to the whole person underneath. My cousin Emma, Maya's older sister, nodded from her spot near the window. Emma had always been more reserved than Maya, working as a social worker in Portland and visiting family only for major holidays. She'd driven down specifically for the wedding, bringing her 2 young daughters who were serving as flower girls. Grandma Eleanor had excellent judge of character, Emma agreed. Remember how she could spot a fake person from across the room? She would have seen right through anyone who wasn't genuine. The comment felt loaded with meaning, though I couldn't tell if Emma was referring to David or making some other point entirely. Emma had always been diplomatic in family conflicts, rarely taking sides but somehow managing to communicate volumes through carefully chosen words. Her presence today felt like having a neutral observer, someone who might witness whatever was about to unfold with objective eyes. As we approached the venue, Emerald Bay Resort nestled against the shoreline like something from a fairy tale. I felt my phone buzz with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen with a simple message. "Can't wait to see you walking down that aisle. Everything's perfect here. Love you beyond words." The sweetness of his message contrasted sharply with the knot of anxiety in my stomach. David represented everything good and hopeful about my future, while the tension with my family felt like chains trying to drag me back into old patterns of doubt and conflict. He'd spent the morning with his groomsmen, probably sharing the kind of easy camaraderie I'd once experienced with my military unit before everything became complicated. Jessica noticed me reading the message and smiled. "That man is absolutely smitten with you. I've never seen 2 people more perfectly matched." She paused, studying my expression. "You know that, right? Whatever weird family drama is happening, it doesn't change the fact that you and David are meant for each other." I wanted to absorb her confidence, to let it chase away the shadows of my mother's whispered phone conversations and my father's distant behavior. Jessica had witnessed our relationship from the beginning, had been there when David first visited me during recovery, had watched us navigate the challenges of my healing process together. If anyone could vouch for the authenticity of our connection, it was her. The limo pulled into the resort's circular driveway, where wedding coordinators waited with practiced smiles and clipboards. Through the windows, I could see early guests, arriving dressed in summer wedding attire and carrying gift bags from the welcome reception the night before. Everything looked picture perfect, exactly as we'd planned during months of careful preparation. But as I stepped out of the limousine, helped by the driver's steady hand, I caught sight of my mother near the venue entrance. Patricia stood with a small group of relatives, her posture rigid with the kind of tension I recognized from childhood moments when she was building up to some kind of confrontation. She wore the navy blue dress we'd selected together, looking elegant and appropriate, but her expression carried an edge that made my stomach clench. Beside her stood my Aunt Helen, my father's sister who'd never quite approved of my military service. Helen had always believed women belonged in traditional roles, had made pointed comments throughout my childhood about girls who tried to do men's work. She'd been particularly vocal during my enlistment process, arguing that the military would ruin my chances for a normal family life. Now she leaned close to my mother, whispering something that made both women glance in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read. My father appeared from around the corner, resplendent in his dress uniform despite being retired. He'd insisted on wearing his military formal wear, complete with his ribbons and decorations, saying it was important to honor the tradition of military weddings. But now, seeing him in that uniform while knowing something was planned, it felt less like honor and more like armor, like he was preparing for battle rather than celebrating his daughter's wedding. The wedding coordinator, a cheerful woman named Rebecca who'd guided us through every detail over the past 6 months, approached with her usual enthusiasm. "Sarah, you look absolutely stunning. Everything is ready for your entrance. The guests are seated, the music is cued, and David is waiting at the altar looking like the happiest man alive." Jessica helped adjust my train while Maya did a final check of my bouquet and veil. Emma's daughters, adorable in their white dresses with sage green sashes, practiced their flower petal scattering technique one more time. The normal wedding activities continued around me while I fought the growing sense that I was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Through the venue's open doors, I could hear the gentle murmur of conversation as nearly 200 guests waited for the ceremony to begin. David's family had flown in from California, his medical school friends had taken time off from their residencies, and our military friends had traveled from bases across the country. People had invested time, money, and emotion into celebrating this day with us. Whatever my family had planned, they'd chosen to execute it in front of everyone who mattered to us. The cruelty of that timing wasn't lost on me. If you want to destroy someone, you do it publicly, in front of their support network, when they're most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves effectively. I touched the hidden recording device, threw my dress one more time, drawing strength from knowing that whatever happened next, there would be evidence. The truth would be preserved, even if it took time to surface. Rebecca gave the signal to begin the processional. As the music started and my bridesmaids began their graceful walk down the aisle, I took one last deep breath of mountain air and prepared to face whatever ambush awaited me at my own wedding. The ceremony itself unfolded like something from a storybook, despite the undercurrent of tension that only I seemed to sense. As the string quartet began Pachelbel's canon, my bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their sage green dresses, each one radiant against the backdrop of Lake Tahoe's sparkling waters. Emma's daughters scattered rose petals with the serious concentration that only 6-year-olds could muster, their white dresses floating like small angels leading the procession. When the music shifted to the traditional wedding march, I appeared at the top of the aisle on my father's arm. The sight that greeted me took my breath away, despite everything else weighing on my mind. Nearly 200 guests rose to their feet, faces beaming with joy and anticipation. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows across the resort's lakeside lawn, each one adorned with eucalyptus and white ribbon. An arch of climbing roses and baby's breath framed the altar, where David stood waiting in his black tuxedo, his face lit with pure happiness. My father's arm felt steady beneath mine as we began our measured walk down the aisle. Colonel James Mitchell had always carried himself with military bearing, but today his posture seemed even more rigid than usual. He nodded to guests as we passed, acknowledging fellow veterans and family friends with the kind of formal courtesy he'd perfected over 3 decades of service. But I could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his jaw was set just slightly too tight for a man celebrating his daughter's wedding. David's eyes never left mine as we approached the altar. His expression held such genuine love and joy that it momentarily pushed aside my worries about family conspiracies. This man had seen me at my absolute worst during recovery, had held me through nightmares and panic attacks, had celebrated every small victory in my healing journey. Whatever storms were brewing with my family, David represented solid ground, unwavering support, unconditional love. The officiant, Chaplain Williams, who'd served with my father years ago, smiled warmly as we reached the altar. He'd known me since childhood, had been the one to counsel me through doubts about military service when I was 18. His presence today felt like a bridge between my military family and my biological one, someone who understood both worlds I'd inhabited. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Chaplain Williams asked in his rich baritone voice. My father cleared his throat, and for a moment I thought I detected genuine emotion breaking through his formal demeanor. "Her mother and I do," he replied, though his voice carried an odd note I couldn't quite identify. He placed my hand in David's with what should have been a father's blessing, but the gesture felt mechanical, like checking off a required item on a duty roster. As my father took his seat in the front row beside my mother, I caught a glimpse of Patricia's expression. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with the kind of focused attention that reminded me of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Beside her, my Aunt Helen wore a similar expression of barely contained anticipation, like someone watching a movie when they already knew the plot twist was coming. The ceremony itself was everything David and I had dreamed it would be. Chaplain Williams spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, about 2 people choosing to face life's challenges together, about building something stronger than either person could create alone. His words about partnership and mutual support felt particularly meaningful given everything I'd overcome to reach this moment. David's vows were perfect, delivered with the steady confidence that had first attracted me to him. He spoke about finding strength in my courage, about learning the true meaning of resilience by watching me heal, about promising to stand beside me through whatever battles life might bring. His voice never wavered, even when emotion made my own eyes well with tears. When it came time for my vows, I looked out over the assembled guests and saw such a mixture of faces. David's family beaming with welcome and acceptance, military friends nodding with understanding when I spoke about finding peace after war. David's medical colleagues who'd become our friends, people who understood the healing process from a professional perspective but had come to love us personally. But scattered. Throughout the crowd were faces that wore different expressions. My extended family members who'd always seemed uncomfortable with my military service. Family friends who'd whispered about my problems since my return from Afghanistan. People who'd never quite known how to relate to the woman I'd become after deployment, who seemed to prefer some version of me that no longer existed. "I promise to love you not despite my scars, but including them," I said, looking directly into David's eyes. "Because you've taught me that healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means building something beautiful from whatever pieces remain." Exchange of rings felt sacred, weighted with significance beyond the simple gold bands we slipped onto each other's fingers. David's hands were steady as always, surgeon's hands that had learned to work miracles through precision and care. When Chaplain Williams pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss we shared felt like sealing a promise that went deeper than marriage, like two people committing to protect each other against whatever forces might try to tear them apart. The recessional. Back down the aisle should have been pure joy. Guests threw rice and flower petals while the photographer captured our radiant smiles. David's hand in mine felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to as we walked through the celebration, toward whatever came next. But even in that moment of triumph, I noticed things that most brides wouldn't have registered. My mother's smile looked forced, like she was performing rather than celebrating. Several of my relatives exchanged meaningful glances during the recessional, subtle communications that suggested coordination. My Aunt Helen checked her watch twice, as if timing was important for something beyond the reception schedule. The cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, guests mingling on the resort's terrace while staff prepared the reception hall for dinner. David and I spent these precious moments greeting friends and family, accepting congratulations, posing for endless photographs against the stunning backdrop of lake and mountains. It should have been pure happiness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in the calm before a storm. David's parents, Dr. and Mrs. Chen, embraced me warmly and spoke about how proud they were to officially welcome me into their family. His mother, a retired nurse, had always understood my medical challenges without making them the center of attention. His father, a literature professor, loved discussing books and had helped me discover authors who wrote about healing and resilience. "You look absolutely radiant," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting a small curl that had escaped from my updo. "David hasn't stopped smiling since this morning. You've both found something special." The contrast between David's family's genuine warmth and my own family's strange behavior felt more pronounced during these conversations. While the Chens asked about our honeymoon plans and talked about future holiday visits, my relatives seemed to be positioning themselves strategically around the venue, like chess pieces being moved into place. Jessica appeared at my elbow with a glass of champagne and her own observations. "Is it just me, or is your family acting weird today?" she whispered. "Your mom keeps checking her phone, and I've seen your Aunt Helen talking to people in corners all afternoon." I sipped the champagne, grateful for Jessica's validation that I wasn't imagining the strange undercurrents. "I think something's planned for the reception," I murmured back. "I just don't know what." As if summoned by our conversation, my mother appeared beside us with her own champagne flute and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, darling, we should head into the reception hall soon. Everyone's so excited for the dinner and speeches." The way she emphasized speeches sent a chill down my spine despite the warm afternoon air. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever ambush was coming would happen during the reception, when all eyes would be focused on the head table, when escape would be nearly impossible, when maximum damage could be inflicted with surgical precision. The reception hall at Emerald Bay Resort had been transformed into something magical. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over round tables draped in ivory linens, each centerpiece a cascade of white peonies and trailing eucalyptus. String lights twinkled overhead like captured stars, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Lake Tahoe as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Everything looked exactly as David and I had envisioned during our planning sessions, down to the vintage gold charger plates and crystal stemware that caught the light like prisms. David and I made our grand entrance as husband and wife to thunderous applause and the opening notes of "At Last" by Etta James. Our first dance felt like floating, suspended in a bubble of pure happiness while nearly 200 people watched us move together across the polished floor. David whispered jokes in my ear to make me laugh, his hand steady on my back, leading me through the steps we'd practiced until they felt like second nature. "Mrs. Chen," he murmured against my ear as the song reached its crescendo. I love the sound of that. For those 3.5 minutes, everything else faded away. The strange behavior from my family, the tension I'd been carrying all day, The hypervigilance that had become my constant companion since Afghanistan. All of it dissolved into the simple joy of dancing with the man I loved while surrounded by people who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate with us. But as the song ended and dinner service began, reality crashed back with uncomfortable clarity. I noticed my mother moving between tables during the salad course, stopping to whisper in certain people's ears with the focused determination of someone executing a carefully planned operation. She'd lean close to guests, share something that made their eyebrows raise, then move on to the next target with military efficiency that would have impressed her husband. My father sat at our head table, still in his dress uniform, cutting his salmon with the same precision he'd once used to clean his sidearm. He nodded politely at David's attempts at conversation but offered little in return, his responses clipped and formal. When David asked about his favorite deployment memories, my father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he deflected with generic comments about duty and service. Aunt Helen had positioned herself at a table near the back of the room, but I could see her surveying the crowd like a general reviewing troops before battle. She'd changed from her ceremony outfit into a severe black dress that seemed more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding reception. Her husband, Uncle Richard, kept checking his phone with the nervous energy of someone waiting for important instructions. The tension was building toward something, and I could feel it gathering like atmospheric pressure before a thunderstorm. My hidden recording device felt both comforting and ominous against my ribs, a small insurance policy that might matter more than I'd initially realized. Every instinct I'd developed as a soldier was screaming warnings, but I was trapped by the formal structure of the reception, expected to smile and play my role as the blushing bride while danger circled closer. Jessica, seated to my left as maid of honor, noticed my growing unease. "You're gripping your fork like it's a weapon," she murmured between bites of her entree. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, the band leader stepped up to the microphone and called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our traditional toast to the happy couple. We'll start with the father of the bride, Colonel James Mitchell." My heart stopped. David and I had specifically discussed the speech schedule during our reception planning. My father wasn't supposed to speak until after the best man and maid of honor had given their toasts. This deviation from the planned program felt deliberate, calculated, wrong. My father rose slowly from his seat, straightening his uniform jacket with movements that seemed too rehearsed for spontaneity. The room fell silent except for the gentle lapping of lake water against the resort's dock and the distant sound of a boat engine somewhere across the water. He approached the microphone with the bearing of a man about to deliver a court-martial verdict rather than celebrate his daughter's wedding. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded respect throughout his military career. "It's not often that we gather in such beautiful surroundings to celebrate love and commitment. So far," his words sounded appropriately paternal, though something in his delivery felt rehearsed rather than heartfelt. David reached over to squeeze my hand, probably sensing my tension without understanding its source. Around the room, guests settled back in their chairs with the relaxed attention people give to expected wedding traditions. "Marriage is about truth," my father continued, and something cold slithered down my spine at his emphasis on that particular word. "It's about building a life together based on honesty, on knowing exactly who you're committing to spend your future with." The shift in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. What had started as a conventional wedding toast was taking a darker turn, and I could see guests beginning to sense it too. Conversations at nearby tables died away as people focused more intently on his words. "David," my father said, turning to address my new husband directly, "you're a fine young man, a doctor, a healer, someone who's dedicated his life to helping others. You deserve to know the truth about the woman you've just married." The words hit me like physical blows. My mouth went dry and my hands began to tremble against the white linen tablecloth. This was it. The ambush I'd been sensing all day was finally beginning. David's confused expression told me he had no idea what was coming. No understanding that we were about to become the center of a very public execution. "My daughter has told you she's a decorated veteran," my father said, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "She's shown you her Purple Heart, told you stories about her service in Afghanistan, let you believe she's some kind of war hero." The room was deadly quiet now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, sensing the electricity in the air. I could see guests leaning forward, their faces shifting from confusion to concern to horrified fascination as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "But what Sarah hasn't told you," my father continued, "is that none of it is true." The words detonated like an IED in the center of the reception hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd as nearly 200 people processed what they'd just heard. David's hand tightened on mine, his surgeon's training probably the only thing keeping him steady as accusations rained down on us. "She was never deployed." "To Afghanistan," my father said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "She was discharged from basic training for psychological instability. The Purple Heart is fake, bought online. The war stories are elaborate fantasies she's created to gain sympathy and attention." I felt like I was drowning in front of everyone I cared about. The room began to spin slightly as shock and adrenaline flooded my system. This wasn't just a family disagreement or a moment of poor judgment. This was character assassination, delivered with surgical precision at the moment when I was most vulnerable and least able to defend myself. "David's son," my father said, his voice softening into something that sounded almost like genuine concern. "My daughter is seriously mentally ill. She's created an entire false identity around military service she never performed. You've been manipulated by someone who doesn't even know the difference between reality and fantasy anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for some kind of response, some explanation that could make sense of what they'd just witnessed. My new husband sat frozen beside me, his face pale with shock and confusion. But through the chaos in my mind, one thought emerged crystal clear. My hidden microphone was recording every single word of this orchestrated destruction, and the truth, the real truth, would eventually surface from the wreckage of this moment. The aftermath of my father's speech felt like stepping into a vacuum where sound and air had been sucked away. For several heartbeats, the reception hall existed, in suspended animation. 200 guests frozen mid-breath, forks halfway to mouths, champagne glasses paused in mid-toast. Even the lake outside seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the whispers began. It started as a low murmur from the back tables, guests leaning toward each other with expressions of shock and confusion. The sound grew gradually, like a tide rolling in, until the entire room buzzed with urgent conversations. Some people were pulling out phones, others were standing to get better views of our table, and a few were already heading toward the exits as if they couldn't escape the secondhand embarrassment fast enough. David's face had gone completely white, except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks. His hand still gripped mine, but I could feel the tremor in his fingers as he processed what he'd just heard. The man who performed life-saving surgeries under pressure, who'd remained calm during medical emergencies that would break most people, now sat speechless as his new wife's entire identity was publicly dismantled. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing chaos around us. "What is he talking about?" I tried to speak, to explain, to defend myself, but my throat had closed completely. The recording device hidden in my dress felt both insignificant and essential, proof of this moment, but useless for stopping the damage already spreading like wildfire through the room. Every eye in the place was on me, waiting for confirmation or denial, waiting to see if I would crumble or fight back. My mother rose from her seat with theatrical timing, her navy dress and perfectly styled hair making her look like she was prepared for cameras. She approached the microphone that my father had just abandoned, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I know this is difficult to hear," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "As Sarah's mother, I've watched her struggle with these delusions for years. We've tried therapy, medication, different treatment approaches, but the fantasies have only gotten more elaborate." The room's attention shifted between my mother at the microphone and me at the head table, like spectators at the world's most uncomfortable tennis match. I could see Jessica's face in my peripheral vision, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. She knew the truth about my service, had visited me during recovery, had seen my medical records and deployment papers. We'd hoped marriage might bring her back to reality, my mother continued. But when we realized David was making life plans based on these fabrications, we knew we had to intervene. He deserves to know who he really married. David's grip on my hand loosened slightly, and I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with old injuries. The man who'd promised to love me, including my scars, was now looking at me like I might be a stranger, like everything he thought he knew had been revealed as lies. At that moment, my voice finally returned. "None of that is true," I managed to say, though my words came out as a croak that barely carried beyond our immediate table. "David, you know me. You've seen my medical records, my discharge papers, my Purple Heart citation." But even as I spoke, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. My mother's performance was polished, believable, delivered with the kind of concerned authority that made people want to trust her. My father's military bearing lent credibility to their claims, and the coordinated nature of their attack suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous malice. "The documents can be forged," my father said from his position near the microphone. "Mental illness often involves elaborate deceptions, Sarah. You've convinced yourself these things are real." Aunt Helen chose that moment to stand at her table near the back of the room. "We have evidence," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the hall. "Medical records from her actual discharge, documentation of her psychological evaluation, proof that she never left the country." The word evidence sent a fresh wave of panic through me. What kind of documentation could they possibly have? My service record was clear, my deployment verified, my injuries documented by military physicians. But the confidence in Helen's voice suggested they'd prepared more than just verbal accusations. Uncle Richard appeared beside his wife, holding a manila folder that looked official and ominous. "We didn't want to do this publicly," he said, though everything about their coordination suggested they'd planned exactly this scenario. "But David has a right to know what he's gotten into." Jessica finally found her voice and stood up from her seat beside me. "This is absolutely insane," she said, her nurse's training probably helping her stay functional when others might have panicked. "I served with Sarah at Fort Carson. I visited her at Walter Reed. I know exactly what happened." To her overseas. "Miss Rodriguez," my mother said, turning toward Jessica with a patronizing smile. "Sarah has been manipulating people with these stories for years. She's very convincing, very detailed. It's not your fault that you believed her." The implication that Jessica was either lying or deluded sent my maid of honor into full protective mode. "Are you calling me a liar?" she demanded, her voice rising above the general murmur of the crowd. "I have photographs, deployment records, letters we wrote to each other. Sarah saved my life during that IED attack." "Jessica, please," my father said, his tone suggesting he was being reasonable while she was becoming hysterical. "We understand your loyalty to Sarah, but enabling these delusions isn't helping anyone." I watched this surreal nightmare unfold around me, feeling simultaneously at the center of everything and completely powerless to stop it. My own family was systematically destroying my life in front of everyone who mattered to me, using my supposed mental illness as both weapon and shield. Anyone who defended me could be dismissed as either deceived or complicit in my delusions. David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, just tell me the truth. Did you serve in Afghanistan or not?" The question should have been simple to answer, but the way he asked it, with such desperate uncertainty, revealed how successfully my family had planted seeds of doubt. This was a man who'd seen my scars, held me through nightmares about Kandahar, celebrated my small victories during physical therapy. Yet here he was, questioning the fundamental facts of my identity. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger now despite the chaos around us. "I served 18 months with the 10th Mountain Division. I was wounded in an IED attack outside Kandahar. Everything I've told you is true." But I could see in his eyes that my words weren't enough anymore. The damage was spreading too fast, the accusations too detailed and coordinated to dismiss easily. My family had chosen their moment perfectly, public, inescapable, designed for maximum devastation. Around the room, guests were beginning to leave. Some slipped out quietly, avoiding eye contact as they made their escapes. Others lingered, with the horrified fascination of people watching a car accident. A few of David's medical colleagues approached our table, their faces showing the kind of clinical concern they might display with a patient experiencing a psychological break. The recording device against my ribs felt like my only lifeline in the chaos, the single piece of evidence that might eventually prove what had really happened here. But for now, I sat in the wreckage of my wedding reception, watching my new marriage crumble under the weight of carefully orchestrated lies, while my hidden microphone captured every devastating word. The exodus from the reception hall accelerated, as my family's accusations hung in the air like toxic smoke. Guests who'd traveled across the country to celebrate with us now gathered their purses and jackets with the urgent efficiency of people fleeing a crime scene. The beautiful lakeside venue that had looked so magical an hour ago now felt like a courtroom where I'd been convicted without trial. David sat motionless beside me, his surgeon's hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. The man who could make split-second decisions that saved lives now seemed paralyzed by the impossibility of determining which version of reality to believe. His dark eyes kept moving between my face and my parents', searching for some clue that would help him navigate this nightmare. "I need air," he finally said, standing abruptly from his chair. "I can't. I need to think." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Watching my husband of 3 hours walk away from our head table felt like taking shrapnel to the chest all over again. He moved through the scattered guests with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, not responding to the concerned voices calling his name. Jessica started to follow him, but I caught her arm. "Let him go," I whispered, though the words tasted like poison. "He needs space to process this." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was protecting David's emotional well-being while my own world collapsed around us. But that's what you do when you love someone. You think about their needs even when your own life is disintegrating. My mother had finally stepped away from the microphone, but she remained standing near the front of the room like an actress taking her bow after a particularly devastating performance. She accepted condolences from departing guests with the gracious dignity of a woman who'd made a painful but necessary decision. Several people embraced her, whispering what I could only imagine were words of support for having to do the right thing in such a difficult situation. That's when I noticed him. Dr. Marcus Webb sat alone at a table near the windows, making no move to leave despite the general evacuation happening around him. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested a lifetime of difficult experiences. I'd never seen him before, had no idea who'd invited him or how he'd ended up at our wedding. While everyone else seemed eager to escape the awkwardness of the situation, Dr. Webb remained seated with his coffee cup, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of someone studying a particularly interesting case. His presence felt different from the rubbernecking curiosity of other lingering guests, more clinical, more purposeful. Jessica noticed him too. "Who is that man?" she asked, following my gaze. "He's been watching everything very carefully." Before I could speculate, Dr. Webb rose from his seat and approached our table with the measured pace of someone who'd made a decision. He wore a simple gray suit that looked expensive but understated, and something about his bearing suggested military background despite his civilian clothes. "Mrs. Chen," he said, using my new married name with quiet formality. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." The chaos of the reception continued around us, but something in his tone made both Jessica and me focus entirely on his words. He wasn't offering sympathy or asking questions about the accusations. He was speaking like someone who had information rather than someone seeking it. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met," I said, my voice still shaky from everything that had just happened. "Are you a friend of David's family?" Dr. Webb glanced around the room, taking in the departing guests and my parents who were still holding court near the front of the hall. "I'm not here as a wedding guest," he said quietly. "I'm here because I've been looking for you for quite some time, Sergeant Mitchell." The use of my military rank hit me like an electric shock. In all, the chaos and accusations, hearing someone acknowledge my actual service felt like finding water in the desert. Jessica's intake of breath told me she'd caught the significance too. "You know who I really am?" I whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I know exactly who you are," Dr. Webb replied. "I also know why your family is so determined to discredit your service record. What I don't understand is how they convinced themselves they could get away with it in such a public forum." My heart began beating so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "You have proof? You can verify my service?" Dr. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio that looked official and well-used. "I have more than proof, Sergeant. I have answers. But not here. Not with this audience. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" I looked around the reception hall, which was now mostly empty except for catering staff beginning to clear tables, and a few stragglers finishing their drinks. My parents had moved their conversation to the terrace, probably strategizing their next moves now that their initial attack had been so devastatingly successful. "The bridal suite," Jessica suggested. "It's private, and Sarah still has the room until tomorrow." Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. "That would work perfectly. I think you'll find what I have to share quite illuminating." As we made our way through the resort toward the suite where I'd gotten ready that morning, I felt like I was walking through a fever dream. Nothing about this day had gone according to plan, and now a complete stranger was claiming to have answers about my military service that somehow my own family was trying to suppress. The bridal suite felt different now, stripped of its earlier magic. The flowers were wilting in their vases, and my wedding dress accessories lay scattered across the vanity like artifacts from a life that had ended hours ago. Jessica helped me into a chair while Dr. Webb settled across from us, his portfolio balanced on his knees. "Before I begin," he said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you will change everything. Once you know the truth, there's no going back to the life you thought you had." I thought about David walking away from our head table, about the guests who'd fled our reception, about my parents who'd just destroyed my reputation in front of everyone who mattered to me. "I'm not sure I have much of a life left to go back to," I said. Dr. Webb opened his portfolio and pulled out a thick file that looked like it contained years of documentation. "Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, 10th Mountain Division, deployed to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan from March 2019 to September 2020. Wounded in action during IED attack outside Kandahar. Awarded Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Medical Badge." Hearing my actual service record recited with such precision made tears spring to my eyes. You know all of that? I know all of that because I was your commanding officer's supervisor, Dr. Webb said. And I know why your family is so desperate to erase your military service that they're willing to destroy your wedding to do it. Jessica leaned forward in her chair. What are you talking about? Why would they want to hide her service? Dr. Webb pulled out a photograph from his file, a group shot of soldiers in combat gear standing in front of military vehicles. I recognized it immediately as one of the last photos taken of our unit before the IED attack that changed everything. Because, Dr. Webb said, pointing to a figure in the back row of the photograph, Sarah's service wasn't the only military record that got complicated that day in Kandahar. He moved his finger to another face in the photograph, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. I was looking at my brother Marcus, my brother who'd supposedly been stationed in Germany during my deployment, my brother who my parents always said had never been in combat, my brother who died in what they'd told everyone was a training accident 6 months after I came home. Your brother was there that day, Sarah. And what happened to him is the real reason your family wants everyone to forget you ever served. The photograph trembled in my hands as I stared at Marcus's face, younger and thinner than I remembered. Him, but unmistakably, my brother. He stood in the back row of our unit photo, wearing the same desert camouflage, the same exhausted expression we all carried after months in country. But according to my family, Marcus had never been deployed to Afghanistan. According to the official story they'd told everyone, he'd been stationed safely in Germany, working logistics at Ramstein Air Base. That's impossible, I whispered, though even as I said it, pieces began clicking into place like tumblers in a lock I'd never known existed. Marcus was never in Afghanistan. He was in Germany when I deployed. My parents told me he was handling supply chain operations in Europe. Dr. Webb pulled out another document from his file, this one bearing official military letterhead and classification stamps. Staff Sergeant Marcus Mitchell was transferred to your unit 3 weeks after your arrival at FOB Chapman. The transfer was classified because he was working on a special intelligence operation that required absolute secrecy, even from family members. Jessica moved closer to examine the documents over my shoulder. Her nursing background had taught her to read medical and official paperwork carefully, and I could see her scanning the pages with professional attention to detail. These look authentic, she said quietly. The formatting, the classification, markings, the signature blocks. This isn't something you could fake easily. Marcus was embedded with your unit as part of a joint intelligence operation targeting IED networks in the Kandahar province, Dr. Webb continued. His logistics background made him perfect for tracking supply chains that fed explosive materials to insurgent bomb makers. What your family doesn't want anyone to know is that he was in the convoy with you the day of the attack. The room began to spin slightly as suppressed memories fought their way to the surface. I'd always wondered why some details of that day remained frustratingly unclear, why certain moments felt like trying to remember a dream. The Army doctors had told me that trauma could fragment memory, that it was normal for combat veterans to have gaps in their recollection of traumatic events. But now, staring at photographic evidence that my brother had been there, images began surfacing like debris floating up from a shipwreck. A familiar laugh in the back of the convoy vehicle. Someone humming a song Marcus used to sing while doing chores at home. A voice calling my name that sounded like family, not just fellow soldiers. He was there, I said, the words coming out like a confession. I remember now. He was in the vehicle behind mine, but when I woke up in the field hospital, no one mentioned him. I asked about casualties from our convoy, and they told me everyone else had survived. Dr. Webb's expression grew somber as he pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Everyone else did survive, Sarah. But Marcus didn't just survive. He performed acts of extraordinary heroism that day. When your vehicle was hit, he immediately left his protected position to reach you under enemy fire. He pulled you from the wreckage and provided medical aid while calling for evacuation. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Marcus kneeling beside me in the sand, his hands pressing field dressings against my wounds while bullets kicked up dirt around us. His voice steady and calm, telling me to stay awake, telling me help was coming. The same voice that had read me bedtime stories when I was little, that had taught me to drive stick shift in our father's truck, that had promised to watch over me when I enlisted. "He saved my life," I whispered, tears beginning to flow freely now. "But the family said he died in a training accident in Germany. They said it was a vehicle rollover during a routine exercise." "The official cause of death is classified," Dr. Webb said carefully. "What I can tell you is that Marcus died during a follow-up operation 3 days after the convoy attack. He'd volunteered for a dangerous mission to gather intelligence on the bomb-making network that had targeted your unit. The operation was successful, but Marcus didn't make it home." Jessica handed me tissues from the vanity table, her own eyes, bright with unshed tears. "So he died a hero, but your family has been hiding that for years? Why would they want to cover up his heroism?" Dr. Webb closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the weight of difficult truths. Because Marcus's mission was part of a controversial intelligence operation that later came under congressional investigation. There were questions about oversight, about whether proper protocols were followed, about whether young soldiers were put at unnecessary risk for questionable intelligence gains. The pieces were falling into place now with devastating clarity. "My father's career," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "He was involved in authorizing those operations, wasn't he?" Colonel Mitchell was the senior officer, who signed off on the intelligence requests that led to Marcus's assignment, Dr. Webb confirmed. "When the congressional investigation began, your father's name appeared in classified documents as someone who'd pushed for more aggressive intelligence gathering despite warnings about operational security. I thought about my father's behavior since my return from Afghanistan, his distance, his discomfort whenever I spoke about my service. I'd attributed it to typical military stoicism, but now I understood it was guilt. He'd sent his son on a mission that killed him, and every time he looked at me, he was reminded of the child he'd lost and the role he'd played in that loss." "The cover story about Marcus being in Germany was designed to protect your father's career," Dr. Webb continued. "If it came out that Colonel Mitchell had authorized operations that resulted in his own son's death, it would have destroyed him professionally and personally. So they created an alternate history where Marcus never deployed, never served in combat, died safely in a routine training accident." "But why destroy my service record too?" Jessica asked. "Sarah wasn't responsible for any of those decisions." Dr. Webb pulled out one final document, this one bearing congressional letterhead. "Because you're a witness, Sarah. You were there when Marcus died. If anyone ever investigated the real circumstances of his death, you'd be the key person who could confirm what actually happened. As long as you remember your deployment and your brother's presence there, you're a threat to the cover story they've built." The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now, and it was bigger and more calculated than I'd ever imagined. So they've been trying to discredit my mental health, make me seem unreliable, so that if I ever tried to tell the truth about Marcus, no one would believe me. The stolen valor accusations, the claims about psychological instability, the insistence that you never deployed. It's all designed to make you appear to be a mentally ill person with delusions about military service, Dr. Webb confirmed. "If you can't be trusted to remember your own deployment accurately, how could you be trusted to remember details about classified operations?" I thought about the years since my return, the subtle ways my family had undermined my confidence, questioned my memories, suggested that my trauma had affected my ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. Every time I'd tried to talk about Afghanistan, they'd redirected the conversation or made comments about how war had changed me in ways that made me unreliable. "They've been gaslighting me for years," I said, the clinical term feeling inadequate, for the systematic psychological warfare my own family had waged against me, making me doubt my own memories, my own experiences, my own sanity. Dr. Webb nodded grimly. And today, at your wedding, they decided to make it public. Probably because your marriage to David represented stability, someone else who would validate your memories and support your version of events. They couldn't risk you building a life with someone who believed in you. The devastating brilliance of their timing was becoming clear. They'd waited until I was most vulnerable, most invested in my new life, most surrounded by people whose opinions mattered to me. Then they deployed their nuclear option, destroying not just my credibility, but my marriage and my support network in one coordinated attack. But they'd made one crucial mistake. Hidden in the seams of my wedding dress, my recording device had captured every word of their carefully orchestrated destruction. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than despair. I felt the cold, focused anger of a soldier who'd just identified her real enemy. Dr. Webb's revelations about Marcus had shifted something fundamental inside me, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The grief and confusion I'd carried for years suddenly had context, purpose, direction. My brother hadn't died in some meaningless training accident. He'd died saving lives and gathering intelligence that protected other soldiers. And my family had buried that heroism to protect my father's career and their carefully constructed lies. "I need to see David," I said, standing from the chair with more determination than I'd felt in hours. "He deserves to know the truth before this goes any further." Jessica looked uncertain. "Sarah, he was pretty shaken up when he left. Maybe we should give him more time to process everything that happened at the reception." "Time for what? To decide whether he believes my family's lies?" The edge in my voice surprised even me. "No. If our marriage has any chance of surviving this, it's going to be because we face it together, with truth, right now." Dr. Webb was organizing his documents back into the leather portfolio, but he paused to look at me with something that might have been approval. "You're going to need allies in what's coming next, Sarah. Your family has had years to perfect their version of events. Overturning that narrative won't be simple or quick." "What exactly is coming next?" I asked, though part of me already knew. The answer would involve choices I wasn't ready to make. "Congressional oversight committees don't like being lied to," Dr. Webb said simply. "When they discover that key witnesses to classified operations have been systematically discredited to prevent their testimony, it tends to generate significant interest. Your father's career isn't the only thing at stake anymore." The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the bridal suite. This wasn't just about family dysfunction or wedding day drama anymore. This was about classified military operations, congressional investigations, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of military command. Jessica helped me out of my wedding dress and into a simple blue sundress I'd packed for the honeymoon we might never take. The symbolism of removing the white gown felt both practical and metaphorical. I was shedding the role of blushing bride and preparing for battle. The recording device came with me, transferred to a pocket where I could access it quickly if needed. We found David on the resort's dock, sitting alone at the end of the pier with his feet dangling in the lake water. He'd removed his tuxedo jacket and tie, rolled up his sleeves, and was staring out across the water toward the mountains like he was trying to find answers in the scenery. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been romantic, but felt melancholy instead. "David," I called softly as we approached, not wanting to startle him. He turned at the sound of my voice, and I could see he'd been crying. The man who'd maintained his composure through medical emergencies and life-or-death surgeries had been broken by watching his new wife's character assassinated in front of 200 people. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said without preamble. "Your parents seemed so certain, so detailed in their accusations. But everything I know about you, everything we've shared together, it all says they're lying." I sat down beside him on the dock, close enough to touch, but giving him space to process. They are lying, David. But it's worse than just lies about my service record. It's about my brother's death, about classified operations, about a cover-up that's been going on for years. Dr. Webb remained standing behind us, his presence both reassuring and ominous. Dr. Chen, he said formally, I'm Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly with Army Intelligence. I have documentation that proves your wife's military service and explains why her family is so invested in discrediting her. Over the next 30 minutes, as the sun continued its descent toward the mountain peaks, Dr. Webb laid out the same evidence he'd shown Jessica and me in the bridal suite. David listened with the focused attention he brought to medical consultations, asking clarifying questions and requesting to examine documents personally. This is insane, David said finally, holding the photograph that showed both Marcus and me in Afghanistan. Her own family has been systematically destroying her credibility for years to cover up their role in her brother's death. It's more sophisticated than simple cover-up, Dr. Webb explained. They've created an entire alternative narrative where Sarah never deployed, never saw combat, never witnessed the events that could implicate her father in questionable command decisions. If she's mentally unstable and prone to military fantasies, her testimony about classified operations becomes worthless. David turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not doubt, but fury. They've been gaslighting you, making you question your own memories, your own experiences. That's psychological abuse, Sarah. Hearing him say it, using clinical terms from his medical training, made the cruelty of my family's actions feel more real somehow. I started doubting myself, I admitted. Sometimes I wondered if my memories of Afghanistan were accurate, if trauma had distorted things. They were so consistent in questioning details, suggesting I was confused about timelines and events. That's exactly what they wanted, Dr. Webb said. Systematic undermining of confidence in your own perceptions. Classic psychological manipulation techniques designed to make you an unreliable witness to your own life. Jessica had been quiet during most of this explanation, but now she spoke up with the practical focus that made her an excellent nurse. So what do we do now? Sarah has proof of what happened at the reception, but how do we expose the bigger conspiracy? Dr. Webb looked at me carefully before answering. That depends on how far Sarah is willing to go. Congressional committees are already investigating the intelligence operations that led to her brother's death. If she's willing to testify about what she witnessed, it could blow the whole cover-up wide open. Testify against my own father? The words felt strange in my mouth, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Testify for your brother, Dr. Webb corrected gently. Marcus died serving his country heroically. His memory deserves better than being buried under lies designed to protect the people who sent him to his death. David reached for my hand, his surgeon's fingers steady and warm against mine. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. I'm sorry I doubted you earlier, even for a second. What your family did today was unforgivable. The apology helped, but I could see the damage in his eyes. The trust between us had been cracked, maybe not broken, but definitely scarred. We'd have to rebuild from this moment, and it would take time to restore the easy confidence we'd shared before my family's attack. I need to think about this, I said finally. Congressional testimony, exposing my father's role in Marcus's death. These aren't decisions I can make while sitting on a dock in a wedding dress. You have time, Dr. Webb assured me. But not too much time. Your family's public attack today suggests they're accelerating their timeline for some reason. They must believe something is forcing their hand. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was my mother, and the message was brief. Clean up this mess, or we'll finish what we started tonight. I showed the message to David and Dr. Webb, watching their expressions harden as they processed the naked threat. My family wasn't done with their attack. Today's public humiliation was just the opening salvo in a larger campaign to destroy my credibility completely. Well, I said, looking out across the lake as the last light faded from the sky. I guess I don't have as much time to think as I hoped. The recording device in my pocket felt like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. My family had made their choice to wage war in public, using my wedding as their battlefield. Now it was time to show them that the daughter they'd tried to erase had learned a few things about strategic warfare during her deployment. The question was no longer whether I would fight back, but how devastating I was willing to make my counterattack. The decision to fight back crystallized in my mind like ice, forming on glass, clear, sharp, and unbreakable. My family had chosen to wage their war in public, destroying my wedding and threatening my marriage to protect their lies. Now they were going to discover that the daughter they'd tried to erase had learned a few things about tactical warfare during her deployment. "Dr. Webb," I said, standing from the dock with newfound resolve, "I need to know exactly what congressional testimony would involve, and I need to know tonight." He nodded approvingly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Representative Martinez chairs the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Intelligence and Special Operations. She's been investigating questionable classified programs for 2 years. Your brother's death is part of a pattern they've been tracking. Young soldiers, put at unnecessary risk for intelligence operations that violated established protocols." David helped me to my feet, his hand steady at my elbow. What would Sarah's testimony accomplish? Besides exposing her father, I mean. It would provide crucial eyewitness evidence about Marcus's actual role in Afghanistan, confirming that he died during classified operations rather than a training accident in Germany. More importantly, it would establish that the Mitchell family has been systematically suppressing witness testimony to protect Colonel Mitchell's career and reputation. The implications were staggering. My family's conspiracy wasn't just about hiding Marcus's heroism. It was about obstructing a congressional investigation into military operations that had cost lives. "How many other families are involved in this cover-up?" I asked. "At least 6 that we know of," Dr. Webb replied grimly. "Young soldiers who died during these questionable intelligence operations, families who were told alternate stories about how and where their children died, witnesses who've been discredited or intimidated into silence." Jessica had been listening intently, her nurse's training making her focus on practical next steps. "Sarah, if you're really going to do this, you need to be prepared for your family to escalate. They've already proven they're willing to destroy your wedding to protect their secrets. What will they do when they realize you're threatening to expose everything?" The threat implicit in my mother's text message suggested we were about to find out. As if on cue, my phone rang with a call from my father. The name Colonel James Mitchell appeared on the screen like a declaration of war. "Answer it," Dr. Webb advised, "but put it on speaker. We need to document any threats or attempts at intimidation." I swiped to accept the call, my finger trembling slightly as I activated the speaker function. "Hello, Dad." "Sarah." His voice carried the cold authority I remembered from childhood moments when I'd disappointed him profoundly. "I think we need to have a family meeting. Tonight. Before this situation gets any more out of hand. I'm not sure there's anything left to discuss," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "You and Mom made your position pretty clear at the reception. What we did was necessary," he said, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. "You've been living in a fantasy world for too long, Sarah. It's time to accept reality and get the help you need." The casual cruelty of his words, delivered hours after destroying my wedding, revealed how completely he'd committed to this version of events. In his mind, I really was the mentally ill daughter who needed to be controlled and contained, rather than the decorated veteran whose testimony could expose his role in Marcus's death. "The only fantasy here is your cover story about Marcus," I said, letting anger sharpen my voice. "I remember now, Dad. I remember him being in Afghanistan." I remember him saving my life. During the IED attack, I remember that he died 3 days later during a classified operation you authorized. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When my father finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the paternal authority, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "And if you continue spreading these delusions, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal options to protect you from yourself. Involuntary commitment, guardianship proceedings, whatever it takes, to get you proper treatment." The threat landed like a physical blow. My own father was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent, to strip away my legal autonomy, to lock me away if I dared to tell the truth about my brother's death. Dr. Webb was frantically scribbling notes, documenting every word of this conversation. "James," I heard my mother say in the background, her voice urgent. "Not on the phone." But my father was beyond caution now, his military mind focused on neutralizing what he perceived as a threat to operational security. "Sarah, you need to understand that some things are bigger than your personal feelings. National security interests require certain sacrifices, certain discretions. Your brother understood that. Marcus understood that he was risking his life to save other soldiers," I shot back. "What he didn't understand was that his own father would cover up his heroism to protect a career built on questionable decisions that got people killed." Enough. My father's voice cracked like a whip across the phone speaker. "You will report to Dr. Harrison's office tomorrow morning for a psychiatric evaluation, or we will have you picked up involuntarily. This conversation is over." The line went dead, leaving the four of us standing on the dock in the gathering darkness. David's face had gone pale, while Jessica looked like she wanted to hit something. Dr. Webb was studying his notes with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd just gathered crucial evidence. "Well," he said finally, "that certainly clarifies their position. Threatening involuntary commitment to silence a potential congressional witness is a federal crime. Representative Martinez is going to be very interested in this recording." I pulled the small digital device from my pocket, the one that had been recording everything since I'd sewn it into my wedding dress that morning. "It's all here," I said, holding up the device. "The reception attack, your briefing about Marcus, this phone call, everything." David took the recorder from my hands, turning it over with the careful attention he usually reserved for surgical instruments. "This changes everything, doesn't it? You're not just fighting for your reputation anymore. You're fighting for other families, other soldiers whose deaths have been covered up." The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders, like a familiar pack from my deployment days. Heavy, but manageable if carried properly. "Representative Martinez," I said to Dr. Webb, "how quickly can we arrange a meeting?" "I can have you in her office tomorrow afternoon," he replied. "But Sarah, once you walk into that congressional building, there's no going back. Your family will use every resource they have to destroy you. They'll attack your mental health, your credibility, your marriage. Everything you care about will become a target." I looked out across Lake Tahoe, where the last traces of sunset were fading into star-filled darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, my family was probably strategizing their next attack, planning how to neutralize the threat I represented to their carefully constructed lies. They'd already destroyed my wedding, threatened my marriage, and promised to have me committed if I didn't comply with their demands. "They've already taken everything they can from me," I said finally. "But they can't take Marcus's memory, and they can't take the truth about what really happened in Afghanistan. If testifying helps other families get answers about their children's deaths, then that's what I have to do." Jessica squeezed my shoulder. "We'll be with you every step of the way." David nodded firmly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. Dr. Webb was already pulling out his phone to make calls. "Representative Martinez needs to hear this tonight. Once word gets out that you're willing to testify, your family will accelerate their timeline for having you declared incompetent. We need to move fast." As we walked back toward the resort, leaving behind the dock where my marriage had been tested and strengthened, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the IED attack in Kandahar. The clarity that comes from having a clear mission and the support to accomplish it. Tomorrow, I would walk into a congressional office and tell the truth about my brother's death, my father's cover-up, and the conspiracy that had cost other families their right to know how their children really died. Tonight, I would prepare for the biggest battle of my life. The war for Marcus's memory was about to begin. The House Armed Services building felt like entering a fortress built from marble and purpose. Security checkpoints, ID verifications, and metal detectors created layers of protection between the outside world and the chambers where national security decisions were made. As Dr. Webb guided David, Jessica, and me through the maze of corridors lined with portraits of military leaders, I felt the weight of history pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Representative Elena Martinez's office occupied a corner suite with windows overlooking the Capitol dome. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her greeting professional, but warm. And her first question cut straight to the heart of everything. "Sergeant Mitchell, Dr. Webb has briefed me on your situation. Before we begin, I need you to understand that your testimony today will trigger a federal investigation that could reach the highest levels of military command. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" I thought about Marcus's face in that photograph, young and determined, serving his country with the same dedication our father had taught us to value above everything else. "Yes, ma'am. My brother died serving his country heroically. He deserves better than being buried under lies designed to protect the people who sent him to his death." Representative Martinez activated a digital recording system and gestured to the court reporter who'd been waiting quietly in the corner. "This is a preliminary interview under oath. Your statement will become part of the official congressional record, and anything you say here could later be used in criminal proceedings. Do you understand?" The formality of the moment made everything real in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. After years of having my memories questioned and my sanity undermined, I was finally in a place where truth mattered more than family loyalty or career protection. "I understand," I said, raising my right hand to be sworn in just as I had when I'd first enlisted in the Army. Over the next 2 hours, I told them everything. My deployment to Afghanistan, the classified nature of Marcus's assignment, the IED, attack that wounded me and triggered his heroic rescue attempt. I described his death 3 days later during the intelligence-gathering mission, the lies my family had constructed about his supposed service in Germany, and the systematic campaign to discredit my memories and mental health. Representative Martinez asked detailed questions about timelines, unit designations, and command structures. Her staff took notes while the court reporter captured every word. When I played the recording from my wedding reception, the room fell completely silent except for the sound of my father's voice publicly destroying my credibility, while my hidden microphone preserved every calculated word. "This is extraordinary," Representative Martinez said when the audio ended. "We've suspected that witness intimidation was occurring in these cases, but this is the first time we've had such clear documentation of the systematic suppression of testimony." Dr. Webb had brought copies of all the classified documents he'd shown us the night before. As Representative Martinez reviewed Marcus's real service record, his actual deployment orders, and the after-action reports from his final mission, her expression grew increasingly grim. "Your brother's death wasn't just covered up," she said finally. "It was part of a pattern of reckless intelligence operations that violated established protocols and put young soldiers at unnecessary risk. We've identified at least 8 similar cases where families were given false information about how and where their children died." Jessica leaned forward in her chair. "How is something like this possible? How do military families just accept alternate versions of their children's service records?" "Grief makes people vulnerable," Representative Martinez explained. When you're told your child died serving their country, most families don't question the details. They trust military leadership to tell them the truth. It's only later, sometimes years later, that inconsistencies emerge. The representative pulled out a thick file folder and spread several photographs across her desk. Each one showed a young soldier in uniform, all of them with the same determined expression I remembered from Marcus's deployment photos. These are the other soldiers who died during similar operations, she said. Their families were all told different stories about their children's deaths. Training accidents, vehicle rollovers, non-combat medical emergencies. None of them were told their children died during classified intelligence operations that are now under congressional investigation. David had been quiet during most of the interview, but now he spoke with the clinical precision that made him an excellent surgeon. What you're describing is a conspiracy involving multiple levels of military command, deliberate falsification of official records, and systematic intimidation of witnesses. How high does this go? Representative Martinez exchanged a look with her chief of staff before answering. We believe it reaches at least to the Pentagon level. The operations your brother died during were authorized by senior commanders who are now in positions of significant authority within the military establishment. The implications hit me like a delayed detonation. My father wasn't just protecting his own career, I said, understanding flooding through me. He was protecting a network of officers who authorize these operations. If Marcus's real death becomes public, it exposes everyone who was involved in the decision-making process. Exactly, Representative Martinez confirmed. Your testimony today provides crucial evidence that this conspiracy extends beyond individual cases. It establishes a pattern of coordinated suppression of witness testimony to protect high-ranking military officials from accountability. As if triggered by our conversation, my phone rang with another call from my father. Representative Martinez nodded for me to answer, and her staff immediately began recording as I put the call on speaker. Sarah, where are you? My father's voice carried an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. Dr. Harrison is waiting for your psychiatric evaluation. If you don't appear within the next hour, we'll have no choice but to initiate emergency commitment proceedings. I'm exactly where I need to be, Dad, I replied, looking directly at Representative Martinez as I spoke. I'm telling the truth about Marcus's service and death. The truth you've spent years trying to bury. You're having a psychotic break, my father said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried the night before. These delusions about classified operations and congressional investigations are symptoms of severe mental illness. You need help, Sarah. Representative Martinez gestured for me to continue the conversation while she scribbled a note to her staff. I could see them making urgent phone calls, probably alerting federal marshals about potential witness intimidation. The only delusion here is your belief that you could cover up Marcus's heroism forever, I said. He died saving lives, gathering intelligence that protected other soldiers. His memory deserves better than being buried under lies designed to protect your career. Sarah, listen to me very carefully, my father said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used when delivering ultimatums during my childhood. If you continue down this path, you will destroy not just my career but your mother's reputation, your family's standing in the community, everything we've built over 30 years of service. Is that really what you want? The question revealed how completely he'd missed the point. This was never about revenge or family destruction. It was about justice for Marcus and the other soldiers whose deaths had been covered up to protect their commanders' reputations. What I want, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do, is for my brother to receive the recognition he earned dying for his country. What I want is for other families to know the truth about how their children really died. What I want is for the officers who authorize these operations to be held accountable for their decisions. The silence on the other end of the line stretched until I wondered if my father had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of paternal concern. replaced by the cold calculation of a military officer assessing battlefield damage. "Then you've chosen your side," he said. "Don't expect mercy from ours." The line went dead, leaving all of us staring at the phone in the sudden quiet of Representative Martinez's office. Outside the windows, afternoon shadows were lengthening across the Capitol grounds, and somewhere in those shadows, my family was probably planning their final assault on my credibility and freedom. But for the first time since Marcus's death, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, fighting for truth, surrounded by allies, and finally honoring my brother's memory the way he deserved. 6 months later, I stood in Arlington National Cemetery as a military honor guard folded the flag that had draped Marcus's casket during his reburial ceremony. The Army had finally acknowledged his true service record, his heroic death, and awarded him the Silver Star posthumously. David squeezed my hand as Chaplain Williams presented me with the flag that should have been given to our family years ago. The congressional investigation had exposed a network of cover-ups reaching into the Pentagon's highest offices. My father faced court-martial proceedings, while 12 other families finally learned the truth about how their children had really died. Representative Martinez's committee had implemented new oversight protocols to prevent future suppression of witness testimony. My mother sat alone in the front row, her navy dress wrinkled and her makeup smudged from crying. She'd divorced my father when the criminal charges were filed, claiming she'd been manipulated into participating in the cover-up. Whether that was true or another calculated lie, I might never know. The recording device that had captured everything was now Exhibit A in a federal case that would reshape military accountability for years to come. My wedding had been destroyed, but my marriage had survived stronger than ever. David and I had learned that truth, however painful, created a foundation that lies could never crack. As we walked away from Marcus's grave, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, complete peace with my family history. My brother was finally home, his heroism acknowledged, his sacrifice honored. The girl they'd tried to erase had become the woman who brought their lies into the light. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button below. Share your own experiences in the comments. You never know who needs to hear that they're not alone in fighting for truth. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with courage to speak when silence would be easier